Good morning. I'm Mike Yerke, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Southwest Iowa Renewable Energy, an ethanol plant near Council Bluffs, Iowa. Nowadays, the news is full of stories about businesses working to reduce their environmental footprint, states seeking to lower carbon emissions, or countries around the world enacting policies to promote cleaner and greener energy. Renewable fuels have an important role to play on our path to a low-carbon economy. And this roundtable will explore some of the issues confronting us on the path to low-carbon ethanol. Today, the biggest tool an ethanol plant has to reduce its carbon footprint is to capture and sequester the CO2 generated during fermentation. Unfortunately, I've seen a great deal of disinformation on these projects. Luckily, this group of experts with me today looks to set the record straight while helping answer the questions that some of you may have. At the close of all of the remarks, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. I encourage you to prepare yourselves accordingly. But starting off first today is David Cruz. Many of you may know him as the chairman of the ag advisory firm Comstock Investments, or from his many Comstock radio reports and newsletters advocating for family farmers. But today, David joins us as an Iowa landowner who still manages his family's corn and soybean farm in northwest Iowa. As a landowner, Mr. Cruz will relate his experience interacting with carbon sequestration projects and ultimately signing a voluntary easement with the project. Please welcome David Cruz.
Thank you for the invitation to be here today. Is the speaker working? Get six that way. I am a Northwest Iowa farmer. We have just under 900 acres that is integrated operationally into about another total 4,000 acres of family land. This next year will be my 50th crop. I was one of the early promoters of the ethanol industry. I recognized the need to expand the demand base for corn. I looked at it as adding a leg to a stool that was previously just had feed and exports. But by adding ethanol, 3 legs is a lot more stable for demand than just 2. I probably initially invested in about 10 different projects, and that has been now diluted, I guess, down to about 3, one of which happens to be Sire. I met Mike yesterday. I thanked him for the dividend check that I got just after the first of the year. I did note that I'd had cataract surgery late last year, and when I got this check and I was trying to examine it closely, and I actually went to my wife and I said, "How many zeros do you see here?" And it was one more at least than what I was expecting. But legacy is something that's very important to me and our family. I'm the 4th generation. My son is now in transition to managing the operation. And he is 5 generations on both sides of the family for him. And he now has a grandson that it is our hope for the future that he too will continue on with our operation. To do that, as my experience of this last 50 years is there's been no other single thing, no other entity that has added more wealth to rural Iowa to the agricultural sector here than the ethanol industry. It's been mentioned, recently our basis levels for even farmers who did not participate in investing in the industry directly, who indirectly have benefited greatly, as basis historically used to be 30-40 cents under Chicago. When I sold my crop recently, it was 60 cents over. And that has become more of a consistent thing. It'll be determined, I suppose, on future crop prospects. But I think the basis has been adjusted by this industry for all to benefit from. My initial experience with easement goes back to the Rock Island power line. I was not in favor of the power line. It didn't meet my standards as a project. It obviously did not ultimately meet the standards of many others, as it only achieved about a 17% approval for voluntary easements when they went to request their regulation from the Iowa Utilities Board, and it failed. My next experience, indirectly this time, was with Dakota Access. And the project did not go through my property, so I was not involved in the easement project. But as I watched it transpire, I did monitor it quite closely, and their pipeline did go very near where my daughter and son-in-law lives in Huxley, Iowa. It was June, and we had gotten 15 inches of rain that year, and it was an absolute mud pit. I was astounded that they did not, at least temporarily, halt the construction. What I saw was a travesty. They were even using posts to corduroy a roadway to get out to where they were actually trying to still bury pipe. That type of thing was sullied greatly the reputation of any future project coming along and provides a hurdle for the CO2 projects now. I can only attest to experience with Summit Carbon Solutions. That is the entity that has gone through our property and which I have signed an easement with. I talked to a lot of clients, a lot of people who were with many concerns over the pipelines, and as we discussed it, they were valid concerns. But what very quickly became apparent to me was that they could be mitigated in an easement, and that it was a matter of a negotiation. And what I did is I organized a group of nearby adjoining landowners, most of which were family, one of which was a 1970 Clay Central High School graduate, a friend of mine. And we met. And we sat down first of all and tried to get to a consensus of what strategy that we were going to take. Well, first of all, we had educated ourselves as to the need for the CO2 pipelines. We understand the world now operates on a carbon score. And I believe the average ethanol plant is in the 50s. And if we can secure or sequester the CO2, we can cut that in half. We also have to compete in Brazil. My son has business experience in Brazil. He married a Brazilian farm girl. And he tells me that eucalyptus is what they use there to power the plant, and they have a carbon score of 17. We have to compete with that as well. And so this is part of for the future transition of this industry to keep this wealth generation coming, that we see where these CO2 pipelines become an integral part of that, something that is a must, that has to happen for us to get our product to our markets. This group of farmers that I put together, first of all, we came to that conclusion that this was necessary. Then the next thing was, will they get it done? Is this the right time to go about negotiating it? Well, we came to the conclusion that they would. We all also came up with probably at least one issue that we wanted to negotiate in an easement. Things like liabilities, the depth of the pipeline, how the dirt is handled, and so on. And we found that they were amenable to negotiating these issues. Probably only one instance could they not come to where we wanted them to be. Probably a couple other instances where we went halfway. But we got probably 80% of what we were looking for out of the negotiation, and that's generally a successful result when you can get 80%. The rest was solved with, I guess, the financial remuneration. It has always been my, opinion that these pipeline or other utilities projects, they attempt to equate the value of their easement to the value of an acre of land. In my opinion, that's preposterous. Other projects, such as fiber optic cables and things that have been buried, they pay for the easement, the direction that they need to go with what it takes to get the project done. And so therefore, we had a different value that we set for what we wanted for the easement. And that was, again, I guess, successfully negotiated in a very tax-friendly manner as that result. So other little things came to light. That high school graduate friend of mine, adjoining property, the pipeline was having to go around a building site. Building site wasn't used anymore, a couple of old bins, whatever. In the course of the conversation, Summit offered to remove it. And that way they could go directly right across without having to deviate around it at extra expense. And it was agreed to. It's gone. It's gone at this time. And the neighbors commented what a good job was done. And again, that's the type of rebuilding of that rapport with the public that needs to happen as this goes forward. So again, legacy is very important to me, and it is important to, I think, most farmers. And it is going forward with this, with these types of CO2 projects that are going to be critical to our future legacy in this industry.
Thank you, David.
Nice job, David.
Thank you.
The fellow panelists, we're going to take a little turn from our initial thinking here on the presentations. I got a note, we've got enough questions waiting in the wings here that we're going to move rather quickly into the Q&A session, so I appreciate your indulgence that way. But let me make some brief introductions of the rest of the group. We have Laith Amon, Carbon Capture Storage Team Lead for Global Safety and Certification Company DNV. An energy expert with over 20 years of experience, Mr. Amon has spent the last 10 years helping support operators on designing and implementation strategies centered around decarbonization. We also have John Thompson, Technology and Markets Director with Clean Air Task Force. John, his past work has taken him around the world from United States to China and Europe, promoting new technology and policy solutions to address climate change with emphasis on the importance of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And finally, we have Dr. Ernie Goss, who is the Chair of Economics at Creighton University. Many of you have probably heard him on the radio discussing his monthly Rural Main Street Index. Dr. Goss will shed some light on the importance of carbon sequestration for the ethanol industry's future and economic impact it could have on the Midwest economy. And again, I welcome any questions. The microphones are in the aisle. Please move there and we'll recognize you throughout the program. But gentlemen, again, good morning and thank you for being with us today. Just a few, kind of open ears. Laith, DNV is a global leader in the realm of risk management and helping businesses with carbon sequestration. What has your experience been with other projects, and what do you say to critics who claim these projects are unsafe?
Thanks for the question. So I think that, the good news here is that for onshore carbon capture, transportation, and sequestration, there is a lot of experience, in particular on the transportation side of that value chain. So, there are CO2 transportation pipelines in the US that go back to the 1950s in terms of construction. And there were, over 2,000 miles of that infrastructure that were established in the 1980s alone. So that sets us up for 40 years worth of operating experience. And everything from any kind of incident, injury, fatality needs to be reported through to DOT as a result of operating that infrastructure. So there's a lot of data there to be able to have a look at and to analyze, how risk-free has the infrastructure been able to be operated, and what that profile looks like. And from 27 systems in 11 states, we've had no fatalities. There have been no injuries to the public. I think there was one injury recorded in the entire period to a contractor. So, just from the perspective of somebody who works across different energy systems, I can see that that's a very robust safety record, and I think sets up a lot of confidence that additional infrastructure can be established and that safety record can be continued.
Thank you. John, turning to you, not everyone here is an expert on carbon capture and sequestration. Can you provide a layman's overview and discuss why your organization believes it is an important tool? Interestingly, I'll just share with the audience, John and I visited last night. I think you told me you've been working on sequestration projects, was it 20?
Yes, 20 years.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for your question, Mike. It's great to be here. The Clean Air Task Force is an environmental group. We're based in Boston. We operate globally. We have headquarters in Brussels, and we span about 14 time zones. Our interest is really in protecting and avoiding the worst aspects of climate change. And in that sense, carbon capture is fundamentally important. In the United States alone, we're probably going to need something like 1,000 million metric tons of carbon capture in our nation alone by 2050. And to put that number in perspective, we're at about 16 million tons every year from industrial sources that's captured and injected underground, mostly for oil and some saline storage as well. So we've got to go from 16 to 1,000. And I would submit to you that here in Iowa, you are the front lines of growing that technology and making these climate plans possible. Because the pipelines that you're considering now, I don't think of as pipelines, I think of them as an environmental story. They're going to capture about 30 to 40 million tons of CO2 every year if they're built over the next 4 years. Think about that. That's almost double what we're doing now. And I would submit to you that our pathways to getting to where we need to go in 2050 go right through Iowa. Because without progress here on carbon capture in this state, it's going to slow down. And if it slows down, we're going to miss our targets. Let me just go on for one more moment if I can. In Iowa alone, the projects will capture about 12 million tons of CO2 every year. I want to put that in perspective. By taking that out of the emissions, that's like reducing the industrial emissions of CO2 in the state by about 40%. That is an important value. That's about what wind and solar have done in displacing CO2 from coal emissions over the last several years. These projects are nationally significant. These projects are a linchpin in achieving our goals. Because I'm not here to talk to you about ethanol. I don't know much about ethanol. What I know about is global warming. And I know the significance of what carbon capture can do. And I understand the significance of what this means and what these projects mean to the country. When I look at the news media stories that come out of Iowa, I don't see and I don't hear the public good case that these projects represent. And if you take one thing from my remarks today, it's that these are fundamentally important to meeting our climate goals.
Thank you, John. I think it's interesting as an ethanol producer. and we think about the genesis of our industry and what we're trying to do, and we talk about what carbon capture represents. The conversation for folks that aren't familiar, perhaps with what we do in agriculture, is around, well, you know, what's wrong with these ethanol plants? And that's not the right question, is it? It's what's right with these ethanol plants. To your point, it comes through Iowa, it comes through the ethanol industry because of our biogenic process. We're a closed loop, essentially, from a CO2 exchange perspective, and we have this very unique position in that chain to, rather than, you know, keep the cycle going, we can take care of it versus what other industries can do. And I think people miss that point. But there's economics based around this as well, Dr. Goss. You've studied the Midwest economy for a long time. With the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, can you discuss how tax credits like the 45Q and the 45Z, terms that we throw about, you know, just out of habit anymore, but weren't common to me for sure 18 months ago. Can you discuss how those tax credits can impact ethanol plants?
Of course, well, first thanks, Mike, and thanks to Lisa Caulfield and her team for putting this together, and my research associate, Monique DeVilliers, who's assisting me today. And she's taking pictures of this so she can send back to my students so they know I'm not partying in Okoboji today, you know. So anyway, I have a class this afternoon at 2 o'clock, so they let me out today. So anyway, I gave them a quiz. That's their punishment for that. But obviously, it is important, and I guess I would really talk about the fact of we in this part of the country depend heavily on renewable fuels, heavily. Iowa is I'll call it a renewable fuels juggernaut. It's number one in ethanol production. It's number two in wind energy production, second only to Texas. As a percent of electricity generated from wind, it's number one at 55%. So the important point here, and economically speaking, is that we benefit from what's going on in D.C., but we can be punished by what's going on in D.C. I worked as a consultant on Trans-Canada pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline, going through, of course, South Dakota, Montana, and Nebraska on down. And the Obama administration approved it, the Trump administration approved it, and lo and behold, a new administration came in the first week, it was nixed. That was an $8 billion loss for the economies, those three state economies we're talking about. So the important point here I would like to say is that we, economically speaking, we are beneficiaries of federal policy, but we're also sometimes victims. And if the delays, or we're talking about delays, and that was what the Keystone XL pipeline was delayed by getting the permission to go across farmland. And I testified before the Public Service Commission in Nebraska, and it was approved. And everything was ready to go, and then of course President Biden said no. And you know, and it's on what Inflation Reduction Act you were speaking of, Inflation Reduction Act that was passed. The problem we have is, one of the problems we have is what happened after COVID-19. We're in a new world, and we're talking about reducing the deficit. That's the budget deficit, and that's a scary moment. It's sort of like the protagonist from Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. And he said, well, how on earth, to Campbell, how on earth did you go bankrupt? He said, well, at first it was gradual, then it was sudden. And that's sort of the way it is. In other words, now we're talking about a whole new regime, whole new way of looking at things. And fortunately or unfortunately for us, we live in a part of the country where policy changes and it has a dramatic impact. And carbon sequestration, I have to say, this study that I did was completed for Wolf Carbon Solutions was last summer. And so some of the findings I'm presenting today come from that study. We're talking about significant economic impacts, and as was presented earlier this morning, 50,000 jobs just from ethanol. Well, what about wind energy. And solar is now coming to, we're seeing more and more solar in Iowa. There's a lot of capacity there. We haven't seen as much development as you might expect in terms of solar, but the part that is concerning is how this part of the country, and I live in this part of the country, as most of us do, is I hate to use the term victims, but also beneficiaries of what happens in public policy and what doesn't happen in public policy and changes in that. And the Inflation Reduction Act calls for a 40% reduction in CO2 emissions by the year 2030. Well, what does that mean if you don't do carbon sequestration? I and my team examined the 3 ADM plants and the sequestration across 4 counties in Iowa. And the impact is significant. And the problem is facing us economically speaking, and I say us, I live in Nebraska, but you can't live in Nebraska and not be affected by what goes on in Iowa. Although the Des Moines News usually covers Illinois. They forget we exist, but we do exist. And you're from Pottawatomie County, you know that. I mean, we're neighbors. But anyway, I'll just give you some numbers on cutting. This is the 3 ADM plants cutting across 4 Iowa counties. The construction impacts, this is state and local taxes, $15.3 million in state and local taxes. Operations, $4 million per year of state and local taxes. And that's just that 3 plants across 4 counties and on into Illinois and being sequestered somewhere in Illinois. Maybe, I don't, Chicago? I don't know. Just kidding. We talked earlier about Chicago. Anyway, it's significant impacts. And this part, and I'll end, I know I've not fully answered your question, but I think we live in the best part of the best nation on the face of the earth, and we're beneficiaries of that right now. As the governor said earlier, the news that she brought to us this morning, we're seeing it. We're seeing it right now, and a lot of that is connected to renewable energy.
Absolutely. And from, the ethanol plant's perspective, essentially at our core, we're a commodity-driven business, right? And we're purchasing a commodity to create another commodity, or actually multiple commodities these days. And the sequestration opportunity represents the same thing. 45Q recognizes an issue and has inserted language to incent a certain behavior. We can't ignore that. In my company, just that single piece is probably something on the order of $25 million a year, right? And so to not move that forward is a disservice to my shareholders. I need to be, clearly driving the business accordingly, let alone all the other ancillary benefits that come from that. But David, you spoke earlier about the decision that a landowner makes, and your own decision. And you talked about being a skeptic initially, but ultimately you came to the point of deciding, and through negotiation, entering into the easement. What advice do you have for other landowners, or what questions would you counsel people to be asking in these sorts of conversations?
I guess the one thing I would counsel is that they make themselves aware of the economic impact of what the CO2 pipelines has on the carbon scores and subsequently on the value of ethanol. When we started this industry, it was all about value added. That's what it was. That's what I haven't heard that term used here lately. It ages me just a little bit. But that's what the whole thing was about. And in CO2 sequestration is another component of the value added. that we need to have to be able to sustain this industry into the future to compete with others with lower carbon scores than what ours. And I do not think that has been information has been well informed to the general farm public, where they understand that. They're looking at a lot of things from the local issues. So they've seen, what Dakota Access, their performance, we kind of call them the Texas Derriers sometimes. But this is an Iowa project, and it's being run by different people with, I think, a different set of ethics and such in this. And so far, what I've seen from it has been good. And to give them a chance, first of all. As I mentioned, that a lot of these concerns are valid, that they had out here, that they fear such, but recognize that they're negotiable. I think they can make a deal, so to speak, because it's in best interest of the state and of our industry.
The value-added phrasing, I mean, that does hit the point. Once upon a time, a couple decades ago now, we would make ethanol, and it seemed like the distillers, some folks referred to it as the byproduct, and what we soon came to realize is a co-product, and there's a value proposition there. Maybe a decade ago, the same thing happened with corn oil, right? It was just something that went out in the feed, and then we got to the point where extraction opportunities existed, and that was another value-added opportunity to bring back to the companies. So I see it very similarly, as you mentioned. And we have a question here. And if you would please state your name and before your question, and who you're with.
Can you hear me? So my name is John Norwood, and I'm here as an individual today. Great conversation. What I'm interested in, we've spoken about sustainability. That seems to be important. And the topic of our climate is really important. We have one of the two most important grain-growing regions here in the world. How do we think of that from a sustainability standpoint? Who's representing the soil? Who's representing the water? Who's representing the rural communities? So 3 examples. We send more than 1 billion pounds of nitrates down our rivers on an average year. That's not sustainable. We've gone through 1/3 to 1/2 of our soil. We've depleted 1/3 to 1/2 of the soil organic matter. These are not sustainable criteria. In our rural communities, Iowa, over 70 of our rural communities are in population decline. So while we are creating tremendous productivity, and while we are doing something important for, I think, our climate, towards our climate goals, how do we think about the soil? How do we think about rural communities in Iowa? How do we think about our water from a sustainability standpoint? I'd be interested in thoughts. I mean, our ethanol plants, we feed them with corn, but maybe we should be feeding them with other things too, like hemp, for example. So how do we think about diversity, resiliency? Those are really important topics that I don't really hear in the conversation today at the scale that we need to be talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, John. David, would you like to take a crack?
I would. As I mentioned, this is going to be my 50th crop year. When I started farming, it was a common practice to mow-bird plow soybean ground. I saw wind blow and ditches get filled with dirt and a number of those types of issues. When it rained, it washed off the hog lot. My perception of the improvement in the sustainability of agriculture is not in line with yours. What I've seen over my lifetime is tremendous improvement. The amount of fertilizer we use to grow a bushel of corn, the way we manage our soil. In our operation now, we're no-till on soybeans. My son is the next generation. He's now strip-tilling in the corn. We don't lose soil. We don't. And that also helps hold the nutrients there so they don't go down the creek, I guess, into the river, into the Gulf. The GMO, that side of it, the biotechnology, has been a tremendous improvement or advantage to the sustainability. This negativism that's portrayed does not correlate with what I've seen in my life. And so I have a hard time answering that question in that way other than to just make those points.
So John, that was So John, I really appreciate your question. And that's something that our organization wrestles with, not just on agriculture, but every time we go into a different industry, whether it's steel, whether it's refining, whether it's pulp and paper. It's a similar set of questions. And carbon capture, I just want to mention, isn't the end of progress on the issues that you raise. It's only the opening. The way we look at all of these industries that we work in at Clean Air Task Force is the need to create options to improve. And carbon capture is one option that ethanol has to go through, but on the table are other changes that will have to evolve over time to actually get us to where we need to be on sustainability. We're going to need to address the nitrogen and phosphorus leaching. We're going to need to address all those kinds of things. But I have faith in the people I see around me here today. In the next 15 years, there's going to be changes that you will be making to address these kinds of problems. Just as you've made changes over the last 100 years, not you individually, but where I come from in Illinois, we have centennial farms, we have sesquicentennial farms, we have bicentennial farms. The first one in Illinois is about 15 miles south of me. All of the changes that we've seen in agriculture over the last 50 and 100 years gives me hope that we can address the fundamental questions that you're raising.
Very good, thank you, John. So, Laith, there is, I'm told there's drone video being used at public meetings and spread on social media purporting to show a catastrophic CO2 pipeline leak and highlighting the alleged danger of the pipelines. Could you shed some light on the backstory of this video and address that, please?
Absolutely. So, as part of the preparation for the safe deployment and operation of CCS infrastructure, regulators will usually always ask for models to be built out around, if there, in the unlikely event that there is an emission or a leak or a failure in something like a pipeline, what does that plume look like? Where is it going to travel? How fast? And that kind of modeling is very essential so that it can inform emergency response plans, and so that plans can be carried out that are accurate to the emission that happens. One thing that's absolutely vital, though, is to take that model out of an academic context and place it into a practical reality. So, is our model actually able to be validated in real life, real world circumstances? The only way you can really do that reliably is to actually do the emission in a test environment and on a sufficient scale for it to be meaningful. So DMV has those facilities and performs that kind of test work. And so the emission that you can see in that video was absolutely essential to collect an enormous amount of practical real world data which goes into informing these models, these models that are critical to emergency response planning activities. And therefore, the real context of the video is actually that as a result of that emission that can be seen in the video, the ability to operate these pipelines safely and have safe emergency response plans was significantly advanced. Unfortunately, there's usually always a misrepresentation of the video, which is to say something like, There's an independent safety science company, DMV, and look how dangerous they are able to show that this, look at this plume, look at how fast it travels. And actually, what you can see in the video isn't even a CO2 emission, really. It's the condensation around a CO2 emission. So, there's just, unfortunately, an enormous amount of misrepresentation of the video. It's a matter of some regret, actually, that we can't have safety science information and put that fact base out there in the public domain for it to be used responsibly. That's a little bit of a shame. But I will say that, those kinds of tests are the kind of activities that the public would want to see happen to make sure that the infrastructure safety aspects are significantly advanced.
Thank you.
I was just going to do a quick follow-up, Laith. Is it true that to simulate that was not like a typical expectation, that was like a worst-case scenario, and it was actually like the pipe was ruptured with dynamite? I mean, that was the extremes you guys went to? Because that does not get shared on social media, I can assure you.
That particular release was on a very significant scale. And, if I look at the test facility where it happened, I mean, it's a military base, actually in the UK, where, there are explosions and things like that happen. So that was the kind of facility that we needed to perform a test like that. But like I say, the practical considerations of emergency response planning for a leak that would be very unlikely. As I said earlier, in 40 years of significant operating experience, we haven't seen anything like that happen in the US. But essentially, a leak on that scale, you have to be able to understand the topography of the land, how the weather impacts, how humidity impacts. It's only really with a real-world experiment that you can actually collect the data that will ultimately make the public safer in the unlikely event of a release. So, the big releases have got to happen, the smaller releases have got to happen, and that's how you validate these models.
Dr. Goss, you and I are going to have an opportunity, I think, later today to visit with some of the Iowa state legislators down at the Capitol on this topic. And there has been, and it was alluded to earlier, some legislation introduced that would certainly impact the ability for some of these projects to move forward. What would it mean for Iowa ethanol plants if CCS was not an option? From an economic perspective, how would that impact Iowa plants if indeed other plants did not have the same?
First off, I say I'm Ernie. I go by Ernie. I only ask my wife and kids to call me doctor, but Anyway, our initial, we talked, the speakers earlier talked about what's coming out of inflation and deficit reduction plan, which also calls for a 40% reduction in the CO2 emissions. And that's quite significant. And at the same time, we also heard that we got 8% of new vehicles sold were EVs this year, and only 1% in operations are EVs. So we've got to move in this direction, in my judgment. Now, that's for voters to decide, but nonetheless, our initial estimates say as much as $1 a bushel of corn if in fact we don't get CO2 sequestration, capture and sequestration, so $1 a bushel. And I remember the time coming to Nebraska many years ago where we were talking about $2.50 a bushel. Now we're $6 to $7 a bushel. But now, of course, we've got the Mexico's GMO corn limitations that may have an impact, though I don't think they'll be implemented. But nonetheless, the challenges that farmers face and the CO2. The CO2 capture and sequestration has fairly significant impacts. I can give some more impacts. Well, again, we're talking about a lot of jobs and a lot of tax collections. And and it's more important to Iowa than any other state, of course, because it is the largest the largest ethanol producer in the U.S. And again, it concerns me that you get in the middle of these things and you don't realize that a change of administrations, all of a sudden you're out of a job, in my case a consulting job, but that's okay, I guess. But nonetheless, farmers are being challenged. We remember $2.50 a bushel corn. Now it's $6 to $7 a bushel. Well, again, pull that back to a buck, at least a buck a bushel, and that's quite significant for the profitability of farmers. And what, I remember a few years ago there was a well-known governor, I think Governor Branstad, who said he wanted to diversify this economy, and he did. But we're still, and that's the same for Nebraska, this part of the nation is heavily dependent on farming. And where the farm goes, our states go. And we have to, I live in Omaha, and some of my colleagues have never been to Lincoln. I mean, we're in Omaha and they've never been to Lincoln. They've never been on a farm, but you can bet those tax dollars that farmers spend show up at Nebraska Furniture Mart. They show up here in Des Moines. They show up all over the state. And we have to be cognizant of that and react to it and respect it. And again, the problem with I'll go back to Keystone XL Pipeline was property rights. And I can't advise farmers on what they should do. And I have to say, to your point about legacy, that's always an important factor to farmers. And of course, and it should be, but nonetheless, having corn prices at its good levels is also very important, and farm income. And this part of the nation has done quite well, as brought up by the governor in her remarks this morning.
Please.
Hi, Mark Benz with Hinghie, molecular sieves, that kind of thing. But we also participate in a lot of other industries, one of them being natural gas. And I was down in Lake Charles, Louisiana a month ago, and I'm going out to Tulsa for the Lawrence Reed thing. The big topic there is CO2. And a lot of the CO2 that's going into the pipeline is being pumped up to the fracking fields. And the reason I know that is the natural gas people are all coming to me and they need to get rid of the CO2 in their natural gas. That CO2 that's being pumped up through the pipeline as for fracking is being mixed with the natural gas and it's being it's being released. How does that affect the mass balance on the carbon emissions coming from CO2 coming from an ethanol plant? Number two is co-products. Whatever happened, there used to be a phrase in this business that anything you can make from a barrel of oil, you could make from a barrel of ethanol. Whatever happened to plastics? The ethanol to ethylene conversion. That's all.
Thank you. Do you want to start with the sequestration versus the natural gas, the kind of EOR? Right.
So let me, for those of you away from the microphone, Mark was just expanding on his and clarifying his question. So Mark, I kind of heard only parts of this, but I want to make sure that I've got it. It's basically, there's a lot of interest in carbon capture and storage in Louisiana right now, primarily because there's a lot of chemical industry there. There's also a lot of great geology that starts in Louisiana and extends into the Gulf Coast. And the example that you're pointing out is that the production of natural gas also brings with it some of the CO2 that's underground. I think that's what you were getting at. Right, right. So this is enhanced gas recovery and enhanced oil recovery have been used in this country since about 1970. In Texas, for example, they've pumped about 1 billion tons of CO2 underground into aging oil fields to produce more oil from those. And what happens each time that CO2 passes through the geology, some of it gets caught and it's trapped in these pore spaces. And over the lifetime of the field, it all gets caught, it all gets trapped, it all gets permanently sequestered. And so that is one of the reasons why we have a technical basis to understand what happens when CO2 is captured at an ethanol plant, taken by pipeline to Illinois or North Dakota, and injected not into oil fields, but injected into saline formations. We know that it's the same physics, it's the same two-phase flow. We know we have 30, 40, 50 years of experience trapping those CO2 molecules deep underground in the pore space. And over geologic time, these turn into rock. This is one of the most well understood and safest things that we have going. So I don't know if I've addressed all of your question, but that's right. So I'm going to repeat for everybody who's not at the microphone. Mark is mentioning that in North Dakota, the CO2 is coming up with the fracking fields. Natural gas processing is one of the least cost ways of separating CO2 from natural gas as it comes out of the field. And for decades, that separation in oil patch areas has been re-injected under the ground to produce more oil. And we think that that's going to also happen with saline storage. The thing that people need to understand about carbon capture, there's no single price. It depends on the concentration. It depends of CO2 in the target gas. It depends on what the product specifications are. And so if you want to inject that methane into the natural gas pipeline, you got to take out the CO2. Customers don't want it. The pipelines don't like it. It has to be removed. And if it's not injected underground, it's vented into the atmosphere. We can't afford to do that anymore.
And the natural gas I'm seeing, and I'm a chemie mass transfer to my bank, and the natural gas I see coming out in North Dakota is 24% CO2. And we can remove that CO2.
That's right. I want to repeat your question so that everybody can follow along. Mark is saying that 24% of that gas that comes out of the North Dakota fields is CO2. And let me just say that's a lot. That's a lot. But your question is?
What does it do to the mass balance on the carbon capture?
Oh, well, that's an easy thing to take out.
They take it out and they re-sequester.
That's right. That's right. The question was, what happens to the mass balance on the CO2? You simply take it out and you re-inject it underground. And the methane, the natural gas, goes into the pipeline. And we've been doing this at Chute Creek, and Century plants and places across the country for decades, and injecting that underground at millions of tons per year. Yeah.
John, why don't you continue, if you would, please, about your background. We spoke last night about, how long you've been working on this, how deep you've been involved with what came to pass ultimately inside the Inflation Reduction Act. You've worked in other countries. Carbon sequestration in Iowa is a relatively new topic. If you could speak to where else it's been done and some of your background that way, I think that would
Sure.
be insightful.
Well, like Mark, I'm a chemical engineer too. I have an MBA out of Washington University in St. Louis. But really, my background kind of on this started when I was a chemical engineering student at the University of Illinois. And they were converting the power plant at the campus from burning gas to coal. And we convinced the governor to put on a sulfur dioxide scrubber. But from there, what I've learned is really, I spent 20 years on carbon capture. This is a technology that's been around for decades, but for the most part, it's only been practiced in relatively low-cost applications, and it's only been practiced when a product needs to meet a certain specification, like the natural gas illustration that Mark brought up. When you use your fertilizer on your fields, I want you to think about a technology called Selexol. That was invented in the 1960s, and it's part of the step. It's a carbon dioxide capture step that's used in the manufacture of fertilizer. So the fertilizer that you use, you wouldn't be able to do without that carbon capture step. Now, What happens to the CO2 when it's captured? It's usually vented, or it's combined with other components in that ammonia to make urea or other fertilizers. But that's been around for decades. And in the ethanol industry, we have about 200 plants in the United States. About 50 of them use carbon capture, mostly to produce CO2 for beverages or for industrial gases and things like that. This is a demonstrated technology. What is less demonstrated is applying this at climate scale. In the more dilute industries like steel or cement, where it's more expensive to do this. And the only reason you do it in those instances, if you've got incentives like the Inflation Reduction Act, or you've got regulations. And it is fundamental for decarbonizing these industries. If you think about cement, 60% of the emissions come not from the fossil fuels of heating up the raw ingredients. They come from the chemistry of converting those raw materials into the final product. 60%. And if you don't have carbon capture on that, you can't address cement's emissions. Why is that important? 8% of the CO2 emitted in the world comes from cement. If we don't have a solution for that, we don't have a way to get to net zero. And if we don't have a way to get to net zero, we can't avoid the worst aspects of climate change.
Thank you. Similar question for you, Laith. DNV has been doing this probably longer than anybody. So do you consider the technology to be proven? Are there experiences you could share in that regard?
Yeah, I think, I can certainly be in a position to agree with the comments that have just been made that, there is I think there's a well-demonstrated fact base that would, that you can look at, which would guide you to believe that you can effectively capture carbon from industrial processes. You can transport it in a way that's safe and compatible with high standards of public safety, and you can sequester it for long, kind of permanent periods of time. One thing I will say, and I guess I have this perspective as part of an organization that works across all of the energy value chains in CCS, is that, there's really a race to decarbonize that is on all across industry. And, sometimes they're responding, industrial players are responding to incentives, sometimes they're getting ready for tariff situations, so they're responding to that. But ultimately, the intergovernmental panels, at the international level that talk about 1.5 degrees C as a limit to global warming, for instance, what they know is that between today and a specific date in the future, there's only a certain amount of CO2 you can actually emit to be able to stay within that 1.5 degree target, and that's called the carbon budget. And actually, we're on course to blow through that entire budget in about 8 years. So right now, if we look across the entire energy value chain, from electrification through to bioenergy production, all different types of hydrocarbon production, and then all of the industrial emissions that go along with secondary processing, I don't think we actually have the luxury right now as a humanity to be able to say, we don't want to decarbonize this sector because it promotes the continuation of a combustion engine, or we should focus on that sector because that's politically what we're more interested in. The fact of the matter is that if, as a human race, we don't have all our eggs in every basket, and if we don't decarbonize everything as quickly as we can, we're going to soon get into a lot of trouble with the climate. And that, there is very attractive places to start where carbon capture is inherently possible at high volumes and low cost. And I think bioenergy is a good example of that, where we should be really focused and really trying to get this done at a level of scale that can, get us back onto a sustainable pathway.
Mike, I'd like to, we of course share the global environment with many nations, and I think this meeting attests to how serious the U.S. is about the environment and taking the right steps. But we fail, and this is off the topic, but we fail to push the administration, whether that's the Trump, the Biden, the Obama, to negotiate with the biggest polluter on the face of the earth, which is China. For example, China created 345 megawatts of coal-fired electricity generation since 2016. 345,000 megawatts. Here in the U.S., 64. So we are doing our part. We need to push our representatives to push China to negotiate. We can't clean up the environment if they continue to see that, hey, this is an opportunity for us. You clean up this, we get to dirty it. As Khrushchev said, I'll paraphrase it, I think, America defecates in its kitchen, which was Cuba, and it comes to your living room. Sorry, it's probably not quite accurate, but you understand what I'm saying. I mean, China's defecating in our environment, and we're doing our part, and we need to continue. I'm not arguing that, but we need to ask and push our representatives to push the administration to negotiate. China. Thank you.
So today the focus has been putting carbon back into the ground, sequestering it. Assuming there are carbon management projects going forward where we have large-scale collection, and this is for anybody, can we envision, or you envision a time where there might be a better use for CO2? Would having commercial-scale amounts of CO2 already collected help that endeavor?
So I'll just say that to deal with planet and climate change, organizations like the International Energy Association say we need to do 6 gigatons of capture worldwide by 2050. 6 gigatons, to put that in perspective, the United States emits economy-wide about 5 gigatons. So any of these storage requirements outside of saline have to meet a cost consideration, and they need to meet a scale consideration. So aggregate production could be one way of avoiding injection underground. Using CO2 in products is another, but the real challenge is getting this to scale, and the scale that addresses climate change. And that's why saline sequestration is so important, is that we have thousands and thousands of years of storage capacity under our feet in the United States for the amount of CO2 that we produce. But we need to find other ways of dealing with that, and utilization is going to be important, but the challenge is scale.
Yeah, I think scale is a very important consideration. I'd say that if we're going to think a little bit more about the concept of scale, and the scale is enormous of the work that we have to do, because we have to fight against our continued emissions, but we also have to perform removals for carbon dioxide that was already put into the atmosphere. We have to get a lot of that back. We're going to have to get more and more of that back and sequester that too. I think the critical path goes through public engagement and public acceptance that at this level of scale, we're going to need an enormous amount of infrastructure to do this. We're going to need to modernize our industry and change the way we're gathering this CO2 and change the way we view CO2 and commercialize CO2 potentially, so that we can set up further incentives to capture it and store it. But essentially, that journey has to have the public on its side. I don't think we have the time to frustrate our efforts or delay our efforts because mistakes have been made or safety incidents have materialized. We have to be really careful as industry participants to do this in a way that brings communities along and ensures high standards of public safety. And I think that's how we get to scale. That's the critical path for me.
David, you mentioned that after careful study and review in your own situation and negotiation, you obviously came to a point where you thought this was a path for you to take. You also acknowledged the fact that there was an oil pipeline that has severely impacted people's acceptance or aversion to such an endeavor. When you talk to your network and you're hearing fellow landowners, fellow farmers talk about this issue, how do you rank, or what do you see as their primary concerns and issues that they want to see addressed?
Well, one of the issues that I do hear discussed is the safety issue, and I thought Lath's comments were interesting along that regard. In my own personal case, I have an anhydrous pipeline underneath one of my farms, and there was an incident with that, not right directly on our farm, but far enough away that was of concern. And so I get this thrown back at me all the time about the CO2 safety. And maybe I've got a question for Lath, I guess, relative to answering that, how significant is the technological advancement relative to the monitoring and managing of the safety of these pipelines to be able to interdict as quickly as possible to mitigate these types of risks?
Yeah, there's a number of strategies, engineering-based strategies that you can deploy when you're designing and operating the pipeline. And actually, there are a number of standards that you can, show through independent assessment that you're meeting in that regard, safety standards. So that's important for people to understand that that's out there. But things like the kind of test work that you do at the commissioning phase of the pipeline, for instance, what's referred to as hydrostatic testing, where you're able to take the pressure, the operating pressure above the design envelope, the operating design limitations of the pipeline for a longer period of time, where you're actually able to examine not just that the pipeline can operate within its safe design limitations, but to go beyond that, how much redundancy is there. There's all kinds of other techniques that would allow you to monitor for things like dents and deformations and things like that can happen around structural integrity. But in the unlikely event that something does materialize and something happens, there's an engineering basis to be able to say that you can limit the scope of the damage that can occur. So fracture arresters that can interrupt something like a running fracture, which is an issue potentially in pipelines. Valves, the depth at which you might bury the pipeline, thinking about proximity to where people coexist with it. There are many strategies there. I think the important thing is that the regulators hold the operators and the developers to high standards, but also that the developers themselves go beyond the regulatory conformity and deliver the extra safety confidence that is required to bring the community with them in the projects themselves.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to thank each of you for the time you spent today and sharing your insight, all of it very interesting and important. Thank you to the audience as well. And please help me extend our appreciation to our panelists.